Hey guys, and welcome to episode 9 in the FCCMA City Managers Bootcamp, where we're doing a little bit more of a deep dive into the subjects that are necessary to be an effective city manager. Today, on this episode, we're going to talk about emergency management, and we're talking to someone who's now retired, but spent a long part of his career in and around emergency management. Tom, thanks for doing this for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me today.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background and what makes you qualified to be an expert on emergency management.
Oh, that's a big question. When I think of becoming qualified, I think about lessons learned and mistakes made over my career that have helped me develop, the experience and the ability to make decisions that I maybe had later in my career. So, from my career standpoint, I spent about half of my public sector career, which over like a 40-year span was in public safety. I started as a 911 dispatcher after I got out of the Marine Corps. I worked my way up through the ranks in the fire service. I went from dispatcher to firefighter, ultimately to fire chief. As the fire chief, I was also the designated emergency manager. I served in several different cities. I was with the city of Tallahassee. I served as their deputy fire chief and city emergency manager. I was in the east coast of Florida in Titusville, where I served as the fire chief / city emergency manager. And then after 19 or 20 years, there were fires in City Hall. So I was given an opportunity to come over.
Metaphorical fires.
Metaphorical fires, yes. But I was asked to serve as an interim city manager that turned into a city manager. And I then served as a city manager over on the east coast of Florida. And then I transitioned to county government.
Tallahassee, Brevard, Longboat Key County, okay.
Yes.
All over the state in all different positions.
That's right. So it was actually started with the town of Davie in South Florida, city of Tallahassee, then Titusville on the east coast, then Sarasota County government, and then Longboat Key, where I retired last year.
And what's interesting about that is you start from the ground up as a dispatcher and then work your way up, always seeing underneath. And we have occasional emergencies in the state of Florida. So, and you've been there to see all that.
Well, and I've had opportunities along the way that I really am thankful for. The state had 3 incident management teams, and they were color coded. So I was on the red team. I was an operations chief. I was trained to be an operations chief. And then the state would send us into local communities or even out of state to assist other local governments. And we would go as an incident management team and help a local government or a region manage an event. So that was very, very helpful for me. I'm a graduate of UCF with my master's degree, but I had an opportunity to teach there for 11 years as an adjunct, and my primary teaching was in the emergency management program, the minor and the certification program.
Tom, this is about as expert as we can get.
Well, I don't know about that.
So maybe Kevin Guthrie, our DEM secretary, who we're gonna do a part of an episode with, hopefully, would be more qualified, but I love this qualification. So help me understand something. We have crises, and then you have things that you call emergencies, emergency management. Define for me what we're talking about here.
So I think for this purpose today, when I think of emergencies, they can be small and they can be large, but they're things that could have a potential longer term impact to a community. And many times in Florida, we think about hurricanes.
Right.
So there are those weather related events like tornadoes, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes that are a big part of emergency management, especially on the preparation stage, because we know at some point we may be impacted by some of that, but it can also be a major fire in a downtown area. It could be a major transportation accident along the interstate or one of the major state roadways. It could be a utility break. It could be a major sewer or water line break that impacts the community for days, and it then triggers this need to staff up an emergency operations center. And many communities maybe don't have a formal, especially the smaller municipalities, don't have a formal emergency operations center, but there's a place in the community where they meet, where it may be at the police department or at City Hall or in some location where they need to manage that whole
Well, you have to have a war room,
right.
so to speak, where I know counties have, by law, required to have an actual emergency operations center, a physical locality. But if you're a city of 2,500, 3,500, you're not going to have that, but you have a big conference room, and it becomes from what you're saying, and an EOC after a crisis.
Yes, and in some cases it may even be a mobile command post that's set up on site or just away from the site to manage a multi-day event. And it's where the command and control occurs. It's where the people who are managing the event, dealing with the public information, and all those other components are going to operate out of.
So it sounds, you said something, multi-day event. So difference between like a crisis, the mayor gets a DUI. You don't need an emergency. You have to deal with it. You have to deal with the press. You have to deal with the messaging. But it sounds to me like an emergency that requires an EOC of sorts, both capitals and small EOC, is multi-agency, potentially multi-jurisdictions, county, city, state, and ongoing.
Yes, because I think like the example you gave, to me it's maybe a communication crisis that needs some efforts, but it's different because it may even have a political component to it or otherwise, where this is really, and you think about the role of the manager, I know which is part of what we're talking about, is to manage the day-to-day. They're usually the executive of the community, and for them to be able to manage that event, so that's, I think, what we're talking about today.
Okay, so large scale, ongoing, requiring, get the team together in the morning and say, okay, who's doing what, allocating resources, et cetera.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. What is the specific role of a city manager during an emergency?
I think it's a great question. I would start off, and you may hear me say this a couple times, but it really depends somewhat. Sure. And so some of that depends on the charter that is in the community and maybe some established roles that the mayor may have in certain levels of emergencies. But I would say in general, it's very clear that the manager in most of those cases serves as the chief executive officer and has the responsibility to really manage completely that event. There may be policy issues that come out of the event, or maybe policy issues that he or she needs support of, but managing the event really is the role of the manager in my view.
And I would assume, you as a city manager or county administrator, you have, I always call it the three audiences. One is your staff, one is your public, and one is your commission. Those three audiences. So it sounds to me it's not different in an emergency. You have an obligation to communicate to the public what you're doing to solve the crisis. You have to keep the mayor and the commission informed, but then you're also the chief of managing who's going to do what in which circumstance.
And that's everyday responsibility of a manager in general.
So it's not that different.
No, related to a planning issue or a utility issue or a public safety issue that's day to day, or even prepping for a commission meeting and discussing issues. The role isn't that much different. There's a lot more pressure. There's a lot more, concentration of time to make decisions. But the role really is that chief executive to lead and ultimately make decisions to address whatever the event is. And in this case, we're talking about emergency management events.
And there's a difference between the role of a city manager, this is after all the FCCMA, city and county, and a county administrator. Explain a little bit of the difference of those two.
Sure, and I would say, both of them have that responsibility of making sure their staff's prepared and that they're trained properly and that their elected officials understand the emergency management system and their role in it, and that public information is important and those kind of things. But the county administrator is a little bit unique in Florida, particularly because we talk about home rule a lot, and the home rule authority of a city. And in most cases, that's true framework, though legislatively sometimes it becomes an interesting discussion. But when it comes to emergency management, there's clear law, Florida Statute 252, that says counties have specific authority over municipalities during a declared event. And even leading
now that's when the governor declares an emergency. Yes. Okay, yes. So when you say declared event, that's a formal. People think it's like, oh, so what? But it triggers statutory movement.
It does, and the role of the county then shifts, where maybe they're a peer and a partner. They take on some oversight role, and one of the key roles from a city standpoint is to get access to mutual aid and resources. You have to coordinate in accordance with the statute through the county. So you can't go directly to the state of Florida or to FEMA during an active operational mode of an emergency. You have to go to the county and request those resources through the county. And that's important, especially when you want the resources, and number two, when you're trying to get reimbursed for some of those afterwards.
Boy, side note, don't be at war with your county if you're one of those municipalities, because you may have to turn around with hand open and say, we need mutual aid, which I find mutual aid is one of the most fascinating aspects of local government, in that we could have a storm in Tallahassee, Florida, or Micanopy, And yet people are being deployed from Alabama because of an organizational agreement up ahead where they're coming in behind the storm to help out to get those lines back up and running. And I think that's a really cool thing. But that has to be done through the county.
Yes, and you think about way back to 1992 and Hurricane Andrew, that was one of the big after action reports is they were overwhelmed with mutual aid. And so there really has to be a structured way to manage that so that because you have to support it when it shows up. They have a place to go to, they have to be fed, they have to be housed, they have all the other things that go along with that. And so it has to be a structured system that can be managed. And so there has to be a thoughtful, structured system to request it and then to support it.
Well, and that makes perfect sense because if you're a small town, let's use one of your former places, Longboat Key, there may not be any housing. There most likely won't be housing on the island. So you're going to turn to the county to say, where can we find a Motel 6 or a Hampton Inn or whatever that is to house these folks while they're working here for the next 3 to 5 to 6 days.
Yes.
And so that gets coordinated through the county.
Yeah, and so from a county government standpoint also, you have the constitutional officers. So if you think about the sheriff and you think about the supervisor of elections and the property appraiser and those other directly elected officials that the county commission doesn't appoint, they're separately elected, but there's an extraordinary role for a manager to keep that coordination going so that everyone is on the same page. And then when you think about one of the biggest events in a hurricane is sheltering, that's typically handled by the school board. And so the school superintendent and the school board have to have a good relationship with the county so they can plan for that because it impacts the schools. They have to shut down the schools. They have to prepare the shelters. They have to help staff them. They have to be involved in turning them back on. And so that becomes a county bigger role.
I guess so that makes perfect sense then that you'd have to work through the county, both for the cross-jurisdictional things as well as you're right. Hey, we need to deploy the sheriffs. Well, if you're a city manager, you can't call the county sheriff who's got a bigger budget than you and a lot more staff than you and tell him or her where to go, what to do. So that goes through the county. It's like, you're right. If we have an upcoming election, how does that managed? Taxes due, property appraiser taxes due, all those kind of things. And we forget that the workers who are often displaced are government workers. Yes. And so the social service personnel might have to leave as well, and coordinating that through the county, I guess, makes a lot of sense. You mentioned something, Alma, I wanted to ask you about, you can't prepare for every emergency, right? A sinkhole collapsing. Obviously, a hurricane is probably the one thing we have the most existing protocols to prepare for, but there's such a wide variety of, a sewer treatment plant overflows into the drinking water, and that's going to be a problem for a week or a month. What do you as a city manager do to prepare your staff and your team to be ready to go in the case of an emergency?
I think defining roles up front, like a department head, a utility director, a police chief, fire chief, they have job descriptions and they have clear roles. But how does the organization shift when there's an emergency event where you may have to wear multiple hats? And the manager may appoint someone to be the incident manager that's not the fire chief or police chief who have maybe a lot of experience in day-to-day stuff.
Tabletop exercises to
That's right, training them and prepping them for it that way to understand the roles, building a backup, because in my experience, whenever you designate someone, they're not there when they're on vacation or they're out sick when the event happens. And so you always need a depth on your team. And then when you train them, and then you have some type of tabletop or other exercising, or some communities have done this, they've applied the emergency management model to non-emergency management events. For instance, when I was in Titusville, we used the emergency management model for the John Glenn launch. And so it was a preparation and oversight, the communication plan, the staging, who was in charge, and how we dealt with logistics and cost and all those things was all managed using the exact same model, just to get used to it more, because you can go years without a hurricane that's significant.
One would hope, right? Yes. And then you have a situation where certain departments, we know after a hurricane, for example, the growth management department will have nothing to do for a few weeks. So several folks we've interviewed on the podcast actually say, well, what you do with those departments, those are the ones you repurpose to for food distribution or for coordinating housing for the mutual aid folks, helping to make sure you're not going to be busy during this emergency. So we're going to have you be the coordinator of this, the coordinator of that, even though it's a little outside of your jurisdiction, which is great for cross-training overall.
That's right. And there's certain roles, like I've found the planning staff are good at, is that planning and forecasting. And so in an emergency management operation, you only have as a planning element. What are we doing today for this 12 hours, but what are we doing for the next 12 and the next 12? And so you need like a planning element as part of your command and control team. And oftentimes with their background, they jump right in and are very good at putting those plans together.
And what do you do about housing during, so you're in Ticeville or Longboat Key or wherever, and you have a hurricane come through, but the personnel that need to be staffing the emergency management are personally displaced as well. What kind of provisions do you make there?
So I'll give you a Longboat Key example. We have an arrangement with Sarasota County that our whole emergency management command team had a location in the county EOC. It wasn't just a liaison, like in a lot of counties you would send a liaison, because we were Barrier Island. We had a room that was called the Longboat Key room, and they have that today, where they just go and operate there, and they have the ability to stay in the EOC and ride out the storm and also operate. The other staff, those that are operational based, typically will go to pre-designated locations. They may be shelters with space set aside, or some other area in the mainland, in that case because of the Barrier Island, that they stay there so that we can control them.
And these things are all worked out in advance before the emergency.
They have to be, right.
Yeah. Hadn't really ever thought about that. Excellent.
And a Barrier Island like Longboat Key, if the island's going to be evacuated, that means everyone. So in the last couple storms, I would say there's at least been 3 activations in the last couple of years on Longboat Key. They've left, everyone leaves. The police leave, the fire leaves, everyone leaves. The elected officials leave. And so there's a place designated for the elected officials to get together if need be to help in the recovery phase after an event, but everyone is ordered off the island. Now, does everyone go? Not everyone always listens to us, but that's a separate issue.
That's right, that's right. Tom, I want to shift gears with you a little bit and talk about some of the technical aspects that are important to understand and know. I think this is important for someone who wants to be a city manager, county administrator, to recognize it's not just about, I'm going to have a good idea, but there's some technical aspects of this that are required knowledge. And in 2 terms, the National Incident Management System, and then there's an incidents.
ICS, the Incident Command System.
Tell me what those things are.
So
they sound really cool, by the way.
And a lot of this came out of, probably back in the 70s and the wildfires in California. And so there had to be a way to manage large-scale events and multiple responders and multiple agencies coming together. So this kind of developed over time to be really the framework in the United States of America. So it's the national federal framework. It's been adopted as that, and it has a lot of components to it. One of those is the Incident Command System, which we can talk about in a minute, but it sets aside qualifications for positions. So if you're in a role like the incident manager or the planning chief or the logistics chief or in finance and administration, it has a whole package of training and a whole package of forms and checklists and other things from every level and position, and it's really very, very helpful. But the federal government set aside a program where they wanted people to adopt this system nationwide, so they tie it to preparedness grants. So if you want to apply for a preparedness grant,
so they don't mandate it, but if you want the cash,
you have to adopt that as your model. And so and that happened a number of years ago. So over time, it's pretty much now the standard, and everyone uses NIMS as a guide. And from a mutual aid standpoint, it's also critical because resource typing. If you think years ago, when someone asked for a brush truck or a tanker or even an engine, it means something different maybe in California or Montana or New England or Florida.
And because this is mutual aid can often be, and often is, a multiple, especially in North Florida, a multi-state thing, you need some sort of federal standard.
Yeah, so
we're talking the same language.
That's right.
I say, send me X kind of truck, and they send me a pickup.
Right, it doesn't help you. So resource typing is what they call it in the model, but so resource typing is standardized so that when you ask for something, it's the same thing no matter what part of the country you're in.
Okay, and what was this, the Incident Command?
The Incident Command System is part of NIMS, or the National Incident Management System, and it's really the command and control component, and it's how you manage emergencies. So it gives you like an organizational chart in a very basic way that says you're going to have an incident manager or an incident commander. There's 4 major functions under the incident commander.
And those people have to be trained through some national portal.
That's right. And so you get an operations section, a planning section, a logistics section, and a finance administration section. There's other pieces like safety and public information, but it has that model all laid out, and it's a scalable model. So if you're one person, a police officer in a car, and you pull up to a major emergency, then all of those boxes in the org chart are you, because you have to do all those things that have to be done every day on an emergency until you start filling them. So then you have to ask for, when the next unit arrives or the fire truck or the ambulance arrives, then you assign them certain duties. You may assign someone to handle press. You may assign a safety officer. You may assign, in a smaller incident, the operations component is critical. You may assign a police commander or a fire district chief to be the manager to handle all operations.
Now, are frontline police officers, sheriff's deputies, are they put through some of this training as well?
They are, and I would say this came out of the fire service, so a good resource for city managers is to talk to your fire chief, because it's pretty much almost 100% adopted by fire service every day on how they handle fires and car accidents and everything else, and they understand the scalability and assignment and growing it. The police departments over the years have been adopting it for a daily operation component as well, or at least know enough about it that they can easily plug into it. And so I think that's a good resource for managers.
You know, what I'm often intrigued by is the relationship between local government and FEMA. I want you to talk about that a little bit, because you know, you can draw down money to reimburse for your expenses for cleanup and reparation. If an emergency is declared, right? Talk a little bit about your experience in dealing with FEMA, because I know there's a lot to do before, during, and after a storm.
I think having that understanding beforehand is an important part of preparation. Once the declaration occurs, or once you're in the active operational component, you don't really deal with FEMA directly too much in Florida as the city, because you're coordinating through the county for resource requests, and the state's involved in managing and tracking those missions. But FEMA becomes critical post-event and recovery. They're going to help with some bringing in resources, if you think about that, and water and blue tarps and all of those things. That's usually coordinated at the state level and the county level. But documentation and reimbursement, again, you trigger back to almost like a home rule scenario for recovery and reimbursement from FEMA. It's critical getting that declaration. And usually when you get a declaration, there's categories. And in Florida, for hurricanes, if you're threatened, your area is threatened, and the governor declares that state of emergency, you want to get what they call category A and B declarations. That pays for emergency measures up front, and then ultimately some debris removal and things will follow out of that. And so once you have that, they pay a certain amount of your prep efforts, not just after impact. And so documentation is critical, getting the declaration is critical, and then you work with FEMA on that reimbursement process.
And you know, as a city manager, county administrator, you do a lot of things to save your municipality or your county money. You do things for investment to generate more revenue so you can provide the services that are needed. I can't think of something more direct and immediate than, I have a storm. Did I properly prep? Mm-hmm. Am I keeping proper track of the debris removal, as an example? Yes. So that I can secure. Now, they don't give you money right away. It might be 3-4 years down the road. 8, 10, $20 million back to your city. If you didn't do that right, you cost your city, I mean, what a responsibility. Yes. $10 million. If you did it right, you could secure $10 million for your city to get reimbursed for doing what you absolutely had no choice to do. You know, remove those trees, get those power lines back up, bring in stuff, house mutual aid workers, put up your team in a temporary housing. All that costs a lot of money. And for a small city like a Crestview or a Micanopy or a Woodville or a Crawfordville, actually, I just named one that's not an actual municipality, but that's a lot of money to lay out, so that maybe in 3 years you get reimbursed. Critical role for the city manager.
It is, and it goes back to that documentation, and then NIMS and the incident command system. There's unit logs as part of the incident command system that every employee who is part of the response fills out every single day. And they have to log their time, their hours, their mission, and what they're doing, if they're using equipment or vehicles, the amount of hours in that vehicle, because all that then goes into the FEMA model of reimbursement and will be audited up front and audited afterwards.
And you know, that's got to be a challenge for your staff, because if I'm dealing with, you know, feeding people, getting people transportation, getting somebody to the hospital, getting electricity turned back on, the last thing I want to do is stop and fill out paperwork. However, you as manager have to convey to your team, guys, I know it's a pain in the butt, but you got to do it, because a year, 2, 3 years down the road, we'll get reimbursed for all of this. Otherwise, we won't get to build that park we wanted to do. We won't be able to do the road widening we wanted to do, the beach renourishment we were working on. All those projects won't get done if we have to send that money to FEMA out to door for emergency reparations and never get reimbursed. So that's an interesting challenge.
And the model clearly has a component or function that is called finance administration and should be activated early up front, so that then making sure everyone has the forms, making sure they're being turned in every day, making sure they're being reviewed by supervision, they're collected so that as they get past the operational event, they can start to package what those costs are and start to think about the reimbursement.
And now that everybody has a cell phone, you could take pictures in real time and get them uploaded. And I guess that's part of the pre-training, is to make sure they understand the dramatic importance of taking care of part of that.
Well, and you mentioned the delay in recovery of those reimbursements, and so having a disaster reserve or an emergency related reserve is critical for municipalities.
Yeah. Something probably 25 years ago you didn't think it was really important, but with the frequency of storms and flooding and stuff, I bet you most municipalities now recognize, and county recognize, we got to have that.
Yeah, in Lombo Key, we developed 3 different reserves. The standard general reserve that you should have, maybe that's 60 or 90 days, and then an emergency management reserve, which could be another 60 to 90 days, which would be like hurricane or major events, and then another, in today's age, economic uncertainty reserve.
Yeah.
Because property taxes could drop like they did in 2006, 7, 8.
Yeah.
And so you never know, but those reserves, you're very thankful for once you have a major event.
And if you own a utility, those reserves, hey, the price of natural gas just dropped, I can buy out 4 months. So there's lots of reasons to have those reserves.
Yeah, because sometimes the public will criticize that you have too much in your savings account as a city. You lower our taxes and lower that, and you don't want to build that up too much, but you need to factor in the unexpected.
Well, and the other interesting thing about that is the public doesn't realize just how much money it costs to run a local government. I remember that was a very big issue in the city of Tallahassee, that we had a $50 million utility reserve. And it was like, oh my God, that's a lot of money. That's 3 months worth of fuel purchases. That's not a lot to say, I've got a 3-month reserve just for this one small component of government. You put it in that context, people go, oh, that's not that much. Or you see $50 million, you're like, man, I could use that back in my checkbook.
Yep, and when you need it, you need it.
Tom, this has been, I've been in and around local government for a long time. We have our podcast, I think we're episode 165. I've learned so much today. It's been really, really enlightening. I hope our audience feels the same way. Let's wrap this up with a few key takeaways when it comes to emergency management. What's important for somebody in county administration, city administration to think about?
Well, and I'll start with one that I think is important. Anytime you have any type of crisis of any sorts, whether it's emergency or otherwise, is if you're the manager, there's a lot of eyes on you by your employees, by the public, by the elected officials, and so
it's your time.
It's your time, and so I've used the term before. Make sure you comb the front of your hair. I don't have any hair, but make sure you comb the front of your hair. But
well, you've been through a lot of emergencies.
That's right. I used to have. When I had a fire chief, I had a whole big head of hair. But I think it's that being calm. And so as a manager, you have to be calm because people are going to look to you to make decisions, give them direction. And sometimes that's hard because you're under tremendous pressure.
Yeah, and no sleep. You got your own family.
Right. But I think being calm and thoughtful as you make the decisions, and because someone else is having an emergency, sometimes you need as a fire chief, I knew that sometimes if I was in the station, I could have all day to make a decision. If I was on a scene of a high-rise building on fire and there were people at the windows trying to figure out if they should jump, then I need to make quick directive decisions. And it's the same thing as a manager, but try to do that in a non-super assertive way that frightens them, that they also get concerned about, are we going to be okay? And so I've always tried to, and it's not always easy, is to be the calming effect as a manager. Say, okay, that's fine, we're dealing with this emergency.
And that really matters. Yeah. When the boss comes in and is frenetic and crazed a little bit, that just through everything. Yeah. I grew up in the restaurant business, and the analogy was always, if you go into a Burger King and the manager's running around doing stuff, that's a poorly run restaurant. If the manager's standing there at rush hour, looking around, watching, they're well staffed, they're well trained, everything's working the way it's supposed to be. And what you're saying is the city manager must be that person.
And I've had staff come up to me and say, we've got really bad news. And we're in the middle of an emergency. We've got really bad news. Like we lost a generator at a shelter, and there's people in there that are medically dependent. And I'll say, okay, no problem. Tell me what the bad news is. And they're like, no, you don't understand. You need to react like you need to get upset because this is bad. And it's like, well, no, that's not going to help matters. Let's thoughtfully tell me what the deal is. Let's talk about what our options are, and we'll figure it out. And I think that's helpful to serve in that role. It's kind of critical. And
To
we
be
do
the
it,
calm leader through all of that.
and we do that on the dais, when we're in a
That's a little
elected
practice.
official. Right, so I think there's practice, and I came up in the fire service, so there's practice there as well. You can't be the one that's, overwhelmed on scene if you're the incident manager. You have to be the one that's thinking about everything.
It's funny because our first video in this series was, what does it take to be a city manager? And what I loved was it thick skin. But what nobody mentioned is calmness during a storm. And what you're saying is, because, and especially if you've prepared, you've practiced, you've done the tabletop exercise, you've been educated, you've got your people certified, that when it's happening, you've got to be the center of the storm. You've got to be the calm in that storm.
Well, and I think one of the ways you do that is if you're comfortable with your knowledge of the emergency management system and NIMS and the incident command system, and you've had some experience or you've trained enough in it that it's not overwhelming to you. It's like prepping for a commission meeting or an agenda item. Maybe it's a big complicated sewer utility issue or whatever it is. When you do your homework, you feel better and can engage more with the elected body and the public, versus if you're just, I didn't have time to look at it this week, I'm just going to go up there and try to
wing it.
And all of a sudden that could fall apart on you. So the same thing happens in emergency, is that training, that experience, that prepping, that the exercising and all those things.
And making sure the key leaders on your team are also have that level of training as well.
That's right. And then the depth that we talked about earlier. And then we talked a little bit about the elected officials, but they're going to want to do something. And one of the things that I think is really important in an emergency is accurate information to the public. And I would say accurate, timely information to the public. And that's kind of your business even more than mine. But I think that's so critical. And what happens in emergencies that I've been on is if we don't do that, then you have elected officials that create their own source of information, and they may hear something,
and they create micro problems from that.
and they don't mean to.
Misinformation.
It's super good intention.
Oh, absolutely, and the public too. Misinformation. What's that old expression? Leaves the dog long before the truth is isn't even prepared. And in that regard, you do have to control the message. You have to get out front. You have to decide who the messenger is, even if you don't have all the information. Whatever facts you have, you become the burning bush there, so that people know to react to your messaging, not Reddit, not Nextdoor.
Right, and then having that one source where everyone go to where the latest, and then keeping it up to date, because if commissioners post an information they received 2 hours ago, and they post it on their own emergency management Facebook page during an active event, that information could be stale, is not up to date, and all of a sudden that creates problems, versus referring them back to, hey, our city or our community has a site where you can get the most accurate information, here it is, instead of regurgitating it where it becomes old and not as accurate. And so there's things like that I've experienced, more stories, but that have created conflict. And you're going to get all these people calling the commissioners, and they're going to go, what can we do about this? What can we do about that? And I've always said, let us take it from you. We can get it logged in, we can prioritize it, and we will respond back. And we will get back to them. It may not be in the next hour.
Listen, if they have the expectation that a city council member can get their electricity restored or the flooding taken care of, then you're going to have a herky-jerky response set, as opposed to, let me get that over to the city manager, let me get that over to the emergency operations center, and let them put it into their bag of tricks, because otherwise you're going to be herky-jerky.
And then we'll handle it. We'll handle it in as timely manner as we can, and we'll follow up with them so they know what we're doing. But don't put yourself in the middle. And a lot of times the commissioners have said to me, thank you. I just thought that would be my role. And sometimes...
So the pre-training comes in,
right? So that exactly what I was going to say is there's a ICS class just for elected officials, designed for elected officials. And one of the ways we've used that is we tie that in then with a tour of the EOC. And we explain to them, they show them the operation, we say to them, that's not where legislative issues happen, that's where their operation is. So there's no seat at the table inside there to manage the event for the elected officials, but you need to see it, you need to understand it, and here's your role. And we bring in someone to help co-teach it with us, is what we've done in the past, and they explain to them, here's the role, here's how the model works, and I think getting that done in advance is critical.
Tom, at one level, thinking about becoming a city manager, this does give me a little bit of heart palpitations, because it sounds difficult, it sounds complicated, it sounds a lot of high level of responsibility. But where I get a little calmer is understanding that there's a lot of pre-training that goes into this, and there's a lot of people who have already been through this training, so you're not going to be on your own when this happens. My takeaway here is that it's not just pre-training sitting around a room going, okay, who's going to be responsible for that, but to make sure everybody has the proper certification, goes through these schools, webinars, certification of training or whatever those things are, so that they're all prepared equally as well.
Yeah, no, I think the preparedness is critical. You know, from my past experience, the biggest thing that's made a difference to me is that kind of exercising, but also I learned being on the state's incident management team that you can call for help, and you should call for help. And help just isn't, I need 5 ambulances or 4 fire trucks or 100 police officers. The help could be, I need someone who's trained as an incident manager to come to my community and help me manage this.
State's DEM is doing a fabulous job growing that. And I think that's both the good and the bad of having so many hurricanes, is they're now staffed up and they can deploy people to provide that.
Yeah, to help with the command and control assistance. So it's not just a police officer, a firefighter, ambulance, you know, dump truck or front end loader. It's, I can send you command and control trained people to come into your city or county and help you manage and organize this, because it's bigger than you normally would have to deal with.
You know, we interviewed the woman who was the city manager of Paradise, California, during the Camp Fire, which 85% of the infrastructure was burned down to the ground in like 2 hours. And she showed up, got up that morning, talked to her incident command, said there's smoke coming up the hill. Don't worry about it, it's headed the other way, it's not going to affect us. Within 25 minutes, the wind had turned, it was raging through town. She rushes to the emergency operations center and says there was nobody there. And I said, oh my God, did you panic? And she said, no. The plan for wildfire was not for anybody to be at the EOC, but to redirect traffic, get people out on the streets. I knew when I showed up and the door was locked and the lights were still off that everything was working, because everybody had been pre-trained. We had done numerous tabletop exercises. They made a conscious decision as to not get rid of the trees because they loved them. They loved the cooling effect and all that kind of stuff. But obviously it had consequences. But that advanced training gave her the calmness to say, I just turned around. I went down to the main street. I saw all the traffic was headed out. They only had, I know it sounds for those 8 people, that was horrible, but only had 8 deaths with 85% of the infrastructure burned to the ground. That shows that pre-training, pre-planning can work.
So I hate to finish with a story, but
I want
this will
you
be
to finish
short.
the story.
This will be short. So back in my Titusville experience as the emergency manager, fire chief, after that kind of first year and learning some of the things that I felt like we learned as a team, we scheduled a big exercise, and the press found out about it and asked if they could attend. Now, I was a brave new fire chief and said, sure. And so I will tell you, the headline in the Florida Today newspaper back then was "Whirlwind of Mistakes in Titusville." That was the headline. The article was excellent, and it said they exercised the plan, they tested all components of it, we were able to observe it. They came up with, I forget how many recommendations, you know, big number, 30 or 40 lessons learned during the exercise. And so it was super valuable. It helped me at that point in my career, and it really helped our team. But the press response to that was "Whirlwind of Mistakes in Titusville."
And you know, what the headline giveth, the fine print can never take it away.
Yeah. But I say it's still critical to do that, even if there's that risk.
But maybe not invite the press.
That's right. I was brave enough to do that, and it wasn't a public meeting because there was no elected officials there. But really, it was a learning exercise, and I thought they would really see and maybe write a nice story about, you know, the effort we put in to get better, continuous improvement. I think the reporter wrote it that way, but the headline that was put on there was not something I would have preferred.
Okay, last question. I'm thinking of becoming a city manager. I am not thinking of becoming a city manager, but someone is watching this, thinking of becoming a city manager. They're listening to this, and which I would say this is the first step. What's the next thing they should do to get a little smarter about emergency management?
Yeah, I think, you know, sometimes it's just maybe when the dust settles, inviting someone who has experience to come talk to them, getting a list of resources of training, and start working on the relationships with their fellow cities in the county and the county administrator as it relates to the EOC and the operations, and just incrementally start exposing yourself to all of that over time. Not trying to, you know, there's not one class you can take tomorrow that'll make you an expert. Okay. And also, you know that you're not going to know everything, just like you don't know, you know, we're generalists in some way as a manager, and you're not going to be I grew up in public safety, so maybe I had a little bit more emergency management background, but still, you're not going to know everything that your departments and all of the functions are that you need to do. You're not going to know them as best as, you know, someone who's in that specific role.
You touched briefly up on a really important point, is collaboration with other governments. know the other city managers, deputy city managers in your county and surrounding counties. Know and be friends with the county administrator and the people in parallel positions to you as well. Not just know them, but have a working relationship with them.
And I would say there's a back system besides the structure of ICS and mutual aid that you don't want to go around the system, but sometimes you need to short circuit it because it's stuck. And so one of the things that I liked in Sarasota County, and the administrator did this after Irma, when I went to Lombo Key and he came in, he was on staff as an assistant and became the manager, but he set up where his cities, there's only 4 cities in Sarasota County, but each one of those was designated to either one of his 2 assistants or deputies or himself. And so as a direct personal contact, if you have a resource request, if you're not getting an answer.
You had a formal relationship.
And so for him and I, because we were friends and knew each other for a number of years, I was his point. So when I was in Lombo Key and we had Hurricane Ian or some other event, I had his cell phone number, could call him directly and say, hey, we're working through the system, but something's happening, it's stuck. And so he did that for every city, had a direct cell phone number to one of his senior assistant or deputy county administrators so they could at least help move the system along. And I think that's only because of relationships they had and we had in Sarasota County. So you can't do that the day of an event. You have to do that today for next year and the year after.
Yeah, what I love about this close is there's a lot of technical aspects of it, but there's a lot of soft skills that go in it, which is building relationships across the board, so people you can rely on. And then eventually, when you become expert and really good at it, they can rely on you as well.
Yeah, and I think as a manager, it's that whole trust but verify. So if you assign someone to be the incident manager, you still have to monitor.
Of course.
And make adjustments as necessary, like you would every day.
Well, this has been fascinating, Tom. I really appreciate it very much, and I know the audience members will appreciate it too. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.